A grieving widower visited his wife's grave who passed away at 8 months pregnant, but when he arrived at the cemetery, he made a shocking discovery. What dark secrets would he uncover about his wife's mysterious death? And how was this even possible when she was buried just beneath the ground? The mist hung low over the Virginia cemetery on that Saturday morning, the sun barely breaking through the clouds. Jordan's car pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, the engine's quiet hum disrupting the morning stillness. He checked his watch. It had been exactly 1 month since Sherry's burial. The weight of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders as he stepped out of the vehicle. Jordan, a 35-year-old man, stood for a moment, taking in the somber atmosphere. The cemetery stretched out before him, a sea of granite and marble markers standing in silent tribute to lives lost. The damp grass crunched softly under his feet as he made his way to the trunk of his car. With practiced movements, Jordan gathered his supplies, a metal watering can filled to the brim and fresh flowers wrapped in green paper. The weight of the water made his steps deliberate as he navigated between the headstones. He had made this journey every Saturday since the funeral, though today felt heavier with the 1-month anniversary looming over him. As he walked through the misty cemetery, Jordan's mind wandered to memories of Sherry. Her laugh, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the excitement in her voice when they talked about their future child. The pain of loss was still raw, a constant ache in his chest that never seemed to subside. He remembered the day they found out they were expecting. Sherry had burst into their bedroom, pregnancy test in hand, her face alight with joy. They had stayed up all night talking about names, planning the nursery, dreaming of the life they would build together. Now those dreams lay shattered, buried 6 feet under with the woman he loved. Jordan's reverie was interrupted as he spotted a female figure through the morning mist. She was standing by Sherry's grave, her posture and silhouette hauntingly familiar, the same height and build as his wife, even wearing similar flowing clothes. His heart raced, a mixture of hope and disbelief coursing through him. "Hello?" Jordan called out, his voice breaking the eerie silence. The woman vanished so quickly it left him questioning his vision. Had she been real, or was his grief playing tricks on his mind? Jordan blinked rapidly, trying to clear both the mist from his eyes and the confusion from his thoughts. He stood frozen for a moment, staring at the spot where the woman had been. Part of him wanted to run after her to confirm what he had seen, but another part, the rational part, told him it was impossible. Sherry was gone. He had attended her funeral, had watched as they lowered her casket into the ground. Yet the image of the woman lingered in his mind, refusing to fade away. Shaking his head, Jordan continued his walk to Sherry's plot. His hands trembled slightly as he set down his supplies. He carefully brushed dust and mist from her carved name, Sherry L. William, and began watering the dry, cracked soil. Small sprouts of wild grass had begun emerging, signs of life above where his wife and unborn child rested. As he tended to the grave, Jordan spoke softly. His words meant only for Sherry. "Hey, sweetheart, it's been a month now. I miss you both so much." His voice broke as he recalled preparing their nursery together, the joy of anticipating their child's arrival. "The room is still there, you know. I can't bring myself to change it. Sometimes I sit in the rocking chair, imagining what could have been." He paused, fighting back tears. "Remember how we used to argue about the color? You wanted yellow, said it was cheerful. I pushed for green, thought it was more soothing. We ended up with that soft mint color, our compromise. It's still there, waiting, just waiting." The memory of being denied a final view of her at the funeral resurfaced, having rushed from the airport only to find the casket already sealed by her family's orders. The bitterness of that moment still stung. "I wish I could have seen you one last time," Jordan whispered, his fingers tracing the outline of Sherry's face in the photograph. "Your family. They took that from me. From us. I don't understand why they rushed everything, why they wouldn't let me say goodbye properly." He sat in silence for a while, listening to the faint rustling of leaves and distant birdsong. The peacefulness of the cemetery contrasted sharply with the turmoil in his heart. He reached out, touching the cold stone of the headstone. "I keep expecting to see you everywhere. In the grocery store, at the coffee shop we used to love. Sometimes I think I hear your voice in a crowd. Is that normal? Am I going crazy?" Jordan's eyes drifted to the spot where he had seen the mysterious woman earlier. I thought I saw you today, just for a moment. I know it's impossible, but it looked so much like you. Maybe I'm just desperate to believe you're still here somehow." He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "I hope you're at peace, Sherry," Jordan said finally. "I hope our little one is with you, and that you're both watching over me somehow. I'll keep coming back every week, I promise." As he finished tending to the grave, Jordan couldn't shake the image of the woman he'd seen earlier. It had seemed so real, so familiar. But it couldn't be, could it? He tried to rationalize it as a trick of the light, a manifestation of his grief. Yet a small part of him clung to the impossibility, the faintest glimmer of hope, in a sea of sorrow. With a heavy sigh, Jordan gathered his empty watering can and stood up. He took one last look at Sherry's grave, the fresh flowers offering a brief burst of color against the somber stone. As he neared the headstone to plant a kiss on it, his gaze shifted to the photo embedded in the stone. It had deteriorated more than he had realized. The colors had faded, washed out by years of unrelenting sun and weather. A deep frown crossed his face as he took in the damage. Preserving her memory, making sure she was remembered clearly and vividly, felt more urgent than ever. Earlier that morning, the thick mist had hidden the extent of the wear, and he hadn't noticed until now. "I'll get that fixed for you, sweetheart," he said softly, making a mental note to visit the print shop that served the cemetery's visitors. It was just a few blocks away, an errand he could easily accomplish before heading home. "I'll be back soon with a new photo. I love you," he murmured, before turning to make his way back to the car, his heart as heavy as his footsteps on the damp grass. As he walked away, Jordan couldn't help but glance back over his shoulder, half expecting to see the mysterious woman again. But the cemetery remained still and silent, offering no answers to the questions that now plagued his mind. The drive to the print shop was short, but it gave Jordan time to reflect on the events of the past day. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that there was more to Sherry's death than he knew. But what could it be? And how could he even begin to unravel such a mystery? The print shop was bustling with activity when Jordan arrived, a stark contrast to the quiet solemnity of the cemetery. He joined the line of customers waiting to print memorial photos, feeling slightly out of place among the chatter and movement. As he waited, Jordan pulled out his phone and began scrolling through photos of Sherry. Each image brought a flood of memories: their first date, their wedding day, the day they found out they were expecting. He found himself scrutinizing the faces of Sherry's friends and family in the background of these photos, searching for someone who matched the woman he saw yesterday. "Next, please," called the clerk, startling Jordan from his reverie. He approached the counter, still distracted. "I need to print a photo for a grave marker, please," he said, his voice low. The clerk nodded sympathetically. "Of course, sir. Do you have the photo selected?" Jordan hesitated, then chose a picture of Sherry from their last vacation together. In it, she was laughing, her face radiant with joy and the promise of their future together. "This one," he said, handing over his phone. As the clerk processed his order, Jordan moved to the waiting area, settling onto a corner bench. He couldn't shake the image of the woman at the grave. He continued searching social media for any friends or family resembling Sherry, finding no satisfactory explanations for what he saw. Time seemed to stretch as Jordan waited, lost in thought. He barely noticed as other customers came and went, their own stories of loss and remembrance swirling around him unheard. "Mr. Williams?" The clerk's voice cut through his contemplation. "Mr. Williams, your order is ready." Jordan blinked, realizing the staff had called his name multiple times. He stood, slightly embarrassed, and made his way back to the counter. The photo had been printed and framed, ready for pickup. Jordan checked the quality, a lump forming in his throat as he looked at Sherry's smiling face. "Sorry about that," he managed to say. "It's perfect, thank you." As he was about to leave, something caught Jordan's eye. A woman was entering the shop, her build and hair color strikingly similar to Sherry's. For a moment, his heart raced. Could it be the same woman from the cemetery? But as she turned, Jordan's hope deflated. While similar, this woman was clearly not Sherry, nor was she the figure he had seen. He shook his head, chiding himself for getting carried away. With the new photo carefully tucked under his arm, Jordan left the shop and headed back to his car. The world seemed a little brighter now, Sherry's smile a beacon of warmth in his grief-darkened world. As he drove back to the cemetery, Jordan noticed more visitors arriving and a funeral procession in the distance. The morning quiet had given way to the soft murmur of grieving families and funeral services. It was a reminder that he wasn't alone in his pain, that the cycle of life and death continued for everyone. Jordan parked his car and made his way back to Sherry's grave, the new photo held carefully in his hands. With each step, he felt a mix of anticipation and dread. Part of him hoped to see the mysterious woman again, while another part feared the disappointment if she wasn't there. As he approached Sherry's final resting place, Jordan's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. But as the grave came into view, he stopped short, his entire body freezing at the sight before him. There, atop Sherry's grave, lay a white infant, carefully swaddled in a blanket. Jordan's mind reeled, unable to process what he was seeing. He blinked hard, certain he must be hallucinating. But when he opened his eyes, the baby was still there, small and vulnerable against the cold stone. Cautiously he approached, his legs feeling weak beneath him. As he got closer, he could make out the baby's features, blonde hair and striking blue eyes that mirrored Sherry's own coloring. The resemblance was uncanny, almost impossible. Jordan's mind raced with impossibilities. His wife had died while still pregnant. He had the hospital documents to prove it, papers his father-in-law Gerald had handed him after the funeral. Yet the timing matched perfectly. The baby appeared to be about 1 month old, coinciding with when Sherry was due. "This can't be real," Jordan whispered to himself, his voice shaking. "It's not possible." He scanned the surrounding area for any sign of who might have left the infant. The cemetery workers were visible in the distance, but no one else was nearby. The baby stirred and cooed, the sound tugging at Jordan's heart despite his disbelief. Torn between confusion and an overwhelming instinct to protect, Jordan gently picked up the baby. The child felt warm and solid in his arms, undeniably real. As he cradled the infant, a wave of emotion washed over him, grief, hope, fear, and love all mingled together in a confusing storm. "Hey there, little one," he said softly, his voice cracking. "Where did you come from?" The baby blinked up at him, those familiar blue eyes seeming to hold all the secrets of the universe. Jordan felt a connection, an inexplicable bond that both thrilled and terrified him. As he stood there, holding the baby and trying to make sense of the situation, 1,000 questions raced through his mind. How did this baby get here? Who left it? And most importantly, could this child possibly be his and Sherry's? The logical part of his brain insisted it was impossible. Sherry had died before giving birth. He had seen her body, had attended her funeral. But another part of him, the part that had been clinging to hope since seeing the mysterious woman, whispered that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this story than he knew. Jordan looked down at the baby again, studying its features. The resemblance to Sherry was undeniable. The shape of the eyes, the curve of the nose, even the tiny dimple in the chin. It was like looking at a miniature version of his wife. "What am I going to do with you?" he murmured, gently stroking the baby's cheek. He knew he couldn't leave the infant alone in the cemetery. The heat was rising, and the child needed proper care. But what were his options? He couldn't just take a baby home without explanation. He needed help, and he needed answers. Realizing he needed guidance, Jordan decided to seek out the cemetery caretaker. Carefully holding the baby, he made his way to the far side of the cemetery, where he had often seen the old man working. He found the elderly caretaker tending to a flower bed, his weathered hands gently pruning roses. The old man looked up as Jordan approached, his eyes widening at the sight of the baby. "Excuse me," Jordan said, his voice urgent. "I found this baby on my wife's grave. Have you seen anyone leave a child here?" The caretaker's response was cryptically poetic. "Heaven's doors have been opened this week, young man. Souls might slip back through, you never know." Jordan frowned, unsure how to interpret the old man's words. "What do you mean? Have you seen anything unusual?" The caretaker shrugged, his eyes twinkling with a mysterious light. "We've had multiple deaths this week. The cemetery's been crowded. Can't be sure if anyone left a baby, but stranger things have happened in this place." Frustrated by the lack of a clear answer, Jordan thanked the caretaker and walked away, the baby still nestled in his arms. He knew he couldn't leave the infant alone in the cemetery. The heat was rising, and the child needed proper care. As he made his way back to his car, Jordan's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The impossibility of the situation warred with the undeniable reality of the child in his arms. He looked down at the baby who had fallen asleep, peaceful and trusting. He reached his car and carefully opened the door, realizing with a start that he had no car seat, no supplies, nothing needed to safely transport an infant. The gravity of the situation hit him full force. Jordan stood there holding the baby, feeling more lost and overwhelmed than he had since Sherry's death. But as he looked at the child's face, so reminiscent of his late wife, he felt a surge of determination. "Okay, little one," he said softly. "I don't know who you are or where you came from, but I'm going to figure this out, I promise." With that, Jordan carefully settled into the car, holding the baby securely against his chest. He knew he needed help, and fast. His mind already forming a plan, he started the engine, casting one last look at Sherry's grave before driving away from the cemetery. As he merged onto the main road, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken another dramatic turn. The mystery of the baby's appearance and its uncanny resemblance to Sherry weighed heavily on his mind. But for now, his priority was clear. He needed to ensure the safety and well-being of this unexpected child. With a deep breath, Jordan steered his car towards the one place he hoped could provide some answers, his friend Tommy's clinic in the neighboring town. As he drove, the baby slept peacefully in his arms, blissfully unaware of the turmoil surrounding its sudden appearance. The drive to Tommy's clinic seemed to take forever, each mile stretching out before Jordan like an eternity. He kept glancing down at the sleeping infant in his arms, still hardly able to believe what was happening. The weight of the child, the warmth of its tiny body against his chest, felt both foreign and oddly familiar. As he navigated the streets, Jordan's mind raced with possibilities. Could this really be his and Sherry's child? But how was that possible? He had seen Sherry's body, had attended her funeral. The rational part of his brain insisted that there had to be some other explanation, but his heart whispered of miracles and second chances. Finally, the clinic came into view. It was a small, unassuming building, but to Jordan, it represented a beacon of hope. Tommy was not only his friend, but also a respected doctor in the community. If anyone could help him make sense of this impossible situation, it was Tommy. Jordan parked haphazardly, his usual care forgotten in his urgency. Cradling the baby carefully, he made his way to the clinic's entrance, his heart pounding with each step. As he pushed open the door, the cool, air-conditioned interior washed over him, a stark contrast to the warm summer day outside. The receptionist looked up, her eyes widening at the sight of Jordan holding an infant. "I need to see Dr. Tommy," Jordan said, his voice low and urgent. "It's an emergency." The receptionist, clearly taken aback, nodded and quickly picked up the phone. Jordan could hear her speaking in hushed tones, though he couldn't make out the words over the pounding of his own heart. Moments later, Tommy emerged from his office, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. "Jordan, what's going on?" Jordan felt a wave of relief at the sight of his friend. "Tommy, I need your help. Something impossible has happened." Tommy's eyes darted to the baby in Jordan's arms, his professional demeanor visibly warring with his personal concern for his friend. "Let's go to my office," he said, gesturing for Jordan to follow him. As they entered the private space, Tommy closed the door behind them, ensuring their privacy. "Jordan," he began cautiously, "where did this baby come from?" Jordan took a deep breath, knowing how crazy he was about to sound. "I found him at Sherry's grave," he said, watching Tommy's expression shift from confusion to disbelief. I know it sounds insane, but look at him, Tommy. He has her eyes, her hair, and the timing. It matches perfectly with when she was due. Tommy's brow furrowed as he processed this information. Jordan, he said gently, I know you're still grieving, but this can't be your child. Sherry died before giving birth. The hospital records— I know what the records say, Jordan interrupted, his voice tight with emotion, but I need to be sure. Can you do a DNA test? Tommy hesitated, his medical ethics clearly at war with his desire to help his friend. Jordan, even if I could, it would take days to process, and there are legal implications. We should really involve the authorities. No, Jordan said firmly, not yet, please, Tommy. I need to know before we involve anyone else. Can't you do something unofficial? The room fell silent as Tommy considered the request. After what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. What you're asking, it's not just bending the rules, Jordan. It's breaking them entirely. If anyone found out— I know, Jordan said, his voice low. But I have to know, please, Tommy. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Tommy ran a hand through his hair, clearly conflicted. Finally, he nodded. All right, but you need to understand, this is completely off the record. The results won't be official, and they might not be 100% accurate. And if anyone asks, this never happened. Thank you, Jordan said, relief washing over him. I understand. As Tommy began preparing for the DNA test, Jordan cradled the baby close, whispering softly to him, It's going to be okay, little one. We're going to figure this out. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Tommy's wife, Liana, who was also a nurse at the clinic, helped care for the baby while Tommy worked on the DNA test. Jordan paced the small office, his mind a whirlwind of possibilities. What if the test was positive? What would it mean? And if it was negative, where had this child come from? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Tommy returned, his face grave. Jordan, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, the test, it's positive. You are the father. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Jordan absorbed the news. A rush of emotions flooded through him. Joy, confusion, fear, and a deep, aching grief for Sherry. But how? He managed to ask. Tommy shook his head. I don't know, but this changes everything. Jordan, you need to go to the police. There's something very wrong here. Jordan nodded, his mind already racing ahead. I will, he said, but not to report the child. I need to confirm Sherry's death first. Tommy and Liana exchanged worried glances. Jordan, Liana said gently, what are you thinking? I need to investigate this myself, Jordan said, his voice firm. Can you keep the baby here for a few hours, just until I can figure out what's going on? After a brief moment of hesitation, Tommy and Liana exchanged glances before nodding their agreement. Don't worry, the woman in the nurse's cap reassured them, her voice calm and steady. I'll take care of her as best as I can. Be careful, buddy, Tommy said, his eyes filled with concern. And Jordan, whatever you find out, remember our deal. You've never been here, and everything we did is off the correct. Don't worry about it, Tom, Jordan said firmly. I'll make sure you're not dragged into this mess. Thank you for everything. I'll come back to get the baby. Jordan's heart heavy with the weight of responsibility and the enormity of what lay ahead. As he left the clinic, he cast one last look at the sleeping infant, his son, on Liana's arm. With a deep breath, he stepped out into the afternoon sun, ready to uncover the truth, no matter how impossible it might seem. The drive to the police station was a blur, Jordan's mind racing with the implications of Tommy's DNA test. The image of the baby, his son, was burned into his memory, a miracle he still couldn't fully comprehend. As he pulled into the station's parking lot, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. Jordan entered the bustling precinct, the noise and activity a stark contrast to the quiet intensity of the clinic. He approached the front desk, his heart pounding. Can I help you, sir? The officer at the desk asked. Jordan cleared his throat. Yes, I need to speak to someone about a possible missing person. The officer raised an eyebrow. All right, sir, can you give me some details? Jordan hesitated, carefully choosing his words. It's about my wife, Sherry L. Williams. She was reported dead a month ago, but I have reason to believe she might be alive." The officer's expression shifted from polite interest to concern. "Sir, that's a very serious claim. Let me get someone to speak with you." Moments later, Jordan found himself in a small interview room, facing two detectives. He could feel their skepticism as he began to explain, deliberately omitting any mention of the baby. "I saw a woman at the cemetery this morning," Jordan said, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. "She looked exactly like my wife. I know it sounds impossible, but I need to know if there's any chance Sherry could still be alive." The detectives exchanged glances. "Mr. Williams," one of them said gently, "grief can play tricks on our minds. Are you sure it wasn't just someone who resembled your wife?" Jordan shook his head firmly. "No, it was her. I'm certain of it." The other detective leaned forward. "Sir, we have official records of your wife's death. The hospital, the funeral home, everything is documented. What you're suggesting, it's not just unlikely, it's practically impossible." Jordan felt frustration building inside him. He knew how it sounded, knew that without mentioning the baby, his story seemed like the desperate imagination of a grieving widower. But he couldn't risk involving the authorities with the child until he understood the full picture. "I understand how it sounds," Jordan said, trying to keep his voice calm. "But please, can you at least check your records? Make sure everything is in order." After a moment of hesitation, one of the detectives nodded. "All right, Mr. Williams, we'll look into it. But I want to be clear, unless we find concrete evidence to the contrary, we have to treat your wife's death as fact." As the detective left to check the records, Jordan sat in tense silence. He could feel the remaining detective's eyes on him, assessing, evaluating. "Mr. Williams," the detective said softly, "have you considered speaking to someone? A grief counselor, perhaps? Losing a spouse is incredibly difficult, and sometimes our minds create scenarios to help us cope." Jordan bit back a sharp retort. He knew they were just doing their job, but the patronizing tone grated on his already frayed nerves. He wanted to tell them about the baby, about the DNA test, but he held back. Without concrete proof, it would only make him sound more unhinged, and he had promised Tommy and Liana not to mention their name or clinic to the official authorities. The other detective returned, a file in hand. "I've checked our records, Mr. Williams. Everything is in order. Your wife's death certificate is on file and legitimate, along with all the necessary documentation from the hospital and funeral home." Jordan's heart sank. But there has to be something, some inconsistency, some detail that doesn't add up. The detectives shared another look. "Mr. Williams," one said gently, "I know this isn't what you want to hear, but all the evidence confirms your wife's passing. The woman you saw at the cemetery, it must have been someone else, perhaps a relative or friends of your wife you weren't familiar with." Jordan shook his head, frustration building. He could see the concern in their eyes, the growing belief that he was a man unhinged by grief. He realized with a sinking feeling that he would find no help here. "Thank you for your time," he said, standing abruptly. I appreciate you looking into this." As he left the station, Jordan's mind was racing. The official records confirmed Sherry's death, yet he had a son, their son, who couldn't possibly exist if those records were true. Something was terribly wrong, and he knew he would have to uncover the truth on his own. He got back into his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The image of Sherry at the cemetery, the baby's blue eyes, the positive DNA test, it all swirled in his mind, pieces of an impossible puzzle. With a deep breath, Jordan started the engine. He had one more stop to make before returning to the cemetery. Whatever was going on, whatever web of lies or misconceptions surrounded Sherry's supposed death, he was determined to unravel it. Jordan drove back to Tommy's clinic, where Liana had been caring for the baby. As he entered, Liana greeted him with a sympathetic smile. "How did it go at the police station?" she asked, gently rocking the sleeping infant in her arms. Jordan shook his head, frustration evident in his voice. "They didn't believe me. Everything in their records shows that Sherry is gone, but we know that can't be true." Liana nodded, her eyes full of concern. "What are you going to do now?" "I need to go back to the cemetery," Jordan said, his resolve strengthening. "There might be more clues there. I'll try asking people. Perhaps there are other funeral caretakers. I have to find out what's really going on. Understanding the gravity of the situation, Liana handed the baby to Jordan and quickly gathered some supplies. "Here," she said, passing him a bag. "I've packed some formula, diapers, baby clothes and swaddles. You'll need these if you're taking him with you. Also, be careful, Jordan, you don't have a car seat for the baby. I couldn't imagine what would happen if—" Jordan accepted the bag gratefully. "Thank you, Liana, for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you and Tommy, and I promise to drive carefully." Before he left, Liana gave him a quick tutorial on feeding and changing the baby. If he cries, check his diaper first. If that's not it, he might be hungry. The formula's easy to mix. Just follow the instructions on the can, and make sure to support his head when you hold him. Jordan listened intently, the reality of caring for a newborn suddenly very real. "I'll do my best," he promised. With the baby securely in his arms and the supplies in tow, Jordan left the clinic and headed back to the cemetery. The afternoon sun was at its peak in the sky as he arrived, casting long shadows across the headstones. Hoping to see more people around that he can question, Jordan made his way to Sherry's grave. But when he reached it, the area was deserted. The baby began to fuss, his tiny face scrunching up as he prepared to cry. Remembering Liana's instructions, Jordan quickly prepared a bottle, using Sherry's tombstone as a makeshift table to mix the formula powder. The baby's cries grew louder, echoing in the quiet cemetery. "Shh, it's okay," Jordan murmured, cradling the infant close as he offered the bottle. The baby latched on eagerly, his cries subsiding. As Jordan fed his son, his eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of the funeral caretakers. He told himself he should be more patient talking to them today, even with all their superstitions. After all, they have been spending years living in this place, but the cemetery remained still and silent. The baby continued to fuss even after finishing the bottle. Remembering Liana's advice, Jordan decided to check his diaper. As he opened the blanket, a note tucked inside the baby's furry hoodie fell to the ground. Jordan's heart raced as he picked up the paper. Written on the back of a laundry stamp card was a simple message: "I'm so sorry for all this, please take care of him." His breath caught in his throat. The handwriting was unmistakably Sherry's. He turned the card over, his eyes widening as he recognized the address stamped on the front. A laundromat in North Carolina, not far from Sherry's family home. Jordan's mind raced with possibilities. Was Sherry alive? Had she somehow faked her death? And if so, why? What could have driven her to such extreme measures? He knew he needed help to unravel this mystery. With trembling fingers, he dialed his mother's number. "Mum," he said as soon as she answered, his voice thick with emotion. "I need your help. Something impossible has happened." Jordan explained everything to his mother, finding the baby, the DNA test, and now this mysterious note. His mother, Sharon, listened in stunned silence from the other end of the line. "Oh, Jordan," she breathed when he finished. I don't even know what to say. What are you going to do?" "I have to go to North Carolina," Jordan said, his resolve strengthening. "I have to find out what's really going on. But, Mum, I can't do this alone. The baby—" "Say no more," Sharon interrupted. "I'll be ready in 15 minutes. Pick me up on your way." Relief washed over Jordan. "Thank you, Mum. I don't know what I'd do without you." True to her word, Sharon was waiting on her front porch when Jordan pulled up 15 minutes later. She had a small overnight bag with her and quickly made her way to the car. As she opened the passenger door, her eyes immediately went to the baby in the makeshift car seat. "Oh, Jordan," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "He looks just like Sherry." Jordan managed a small smile. "I know it's a lot to take in, Mum. Thank you for coming with us." Sharon reached over and squeezed his hand. "And I have packed everything the baby needs. I had a quick run to the convenience store." "You're the best, Mom," Jordan said. "We're family. We'll figure this out together." With his mother by his side and his son safely secured, Jordan felt a renewed sense of determination as he pulled away from the curb. The road to North Carolina, and hopefully to answers, stretched out before them. The highway seemed to unfold endlessly as they drove, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkening landscape. Jordan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Beside him, Sharon cradled the baby, her experienced hands managing feedings and diaper changes with practiced ease. "How's he doing?" Jordan asked, glancing over at his son. The word still felt strange on his tongue. Son. A miracle he never thought he'd experience after Sherry's supposed death. Sharon smiled softly. "He's perfect, Jordan, sleeping like an angel." She paused, her expression growing serious. "But we really need to get a proper car seat. This isn't safe." Jordan nodded, guilt mingling with the myriad of other emotions swirling within him. "I know. We'll stop at the next big town and pick one up. I couldn't wait. We need answers." As they drove, Sharon filled the car with quiet conversation, asking questions about the events of the day. Jordan recounted everything: the woman at the cemetery, finding the baby, the DNA test at Tommy's clinic. With each retelling, the reality of the situation seemed to solidify, becoming less dreamlike and more urgently real. "What I don't understand," Sharon said, her voice low so as not to wake the baby, "is why Sherry's family would do this. The hostility at the funeral, refusing to let you view the body, rushing to seal the casket. It all seems so cruel." Jordan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I've been thinking about that too. They never approved of our relationship. Gerald, her father especially. He always made it clear he thought Sherry could do better than me." "Better than you?" Sharon's voice was sharp with maternal indignation. "You were nothing but good to Sherry. You loved her, supported her dreams. What more could a father want for his daughter?" Jordan sighed. I think it was about more than just me. The way Gerald looked at us sometimes, I always got the feeling he saw me as somehow less than them, less worthy." A heavy silence fell over the car as the implications of Jordan's words sank in. The soft sounds of the baby's breathing filled the space, a reminder of the innocent life caught in the middle of this tangled web. As they approached the familiar neighborhood where Sherry had grown up, Jordan's chest tightened. The manicured lawns of the golf course came into view, followed by the sparkling surface of the lake. And there, perched on its hill like a fortress, stood the Williams family mansion. Memories flooded back, happy ones of his life with Sherry mixed with the bitter recollection of her family's constant disapproval. The last time he had been here was to move Sherry's belongings to Virginia, a day filled with tense silences and barely concealed hostility. Jordan parked at the gatehouse, his heart racing. "Mum, I need you to wait here with the baby. If anything goes wrong—" Sharon nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Be careful, Jordan. And remember, no matter what happens in there, you have a son who needs you now." With a deep breath, Jordan stepped out of the car and approached the intercom. The guard's voice crackled through the speaker, immediately hostile upon hearing Jordan's name. "Mr. Williams is not expecting visitors," the guard said, his tone clipped. "Please," Jordan insisted. "I'm Sherry's husband, Gerald's son-in-law. It's important that I speak with him." Several tense minutes passed, filled with Jordan's repeated pleas and identifications. Finally, with a reluctant buzz, the gates swung open. As Jordan drove up to the mansion's circular driveway, he could see Thelma and Gerald standing in the doorway, their postures rigid with tension. He took a moment to study the imposing facade of the house, steeling himself for the confrontation to come. Turning to Sharon, who still cradled the sleeping baby, Jordan spoke softly. "Whatever happens, Mom, remember that child is the most important thing now. If things go badly—" Sharon nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I'll protect him with my life, Jordan. Now go. Find out the truth." With one last look at his son, Jordan stepped out of the car and walked towards the mansion's entrance. Each step felt heavy, laden with the weight of unanswered questions and the desperate hope for answers. As he approached, Gerald's voice rang out, falsely jovial. "Jordan, my boy, what an unexpected surprise. I'm afraid there's been some mistake with the security. Come in, come in." But even as the words left Gerald's mouth, Jordan could see the tension in his posture, the barely concealed hostility in his eyes. This was not going to be an easy conversation. Taking a deep breath, Jordan ascended the marble steps, ready to confront whatever lay behind the mansion's imposing doors. The truth about Sherry, about their child, about the web of lies that had torn his life apart. It was all within reach, and he was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The tension in the air was palpable as Jordan stood face to face with Thelma and Gerald on the mansion's grand entrance. The mid-afternoon sun cast shadows across the marble steps, highlighting the physical and emotional barrier between them. Gerald's voice carried an undercurrent of tension as he spoke, his politeness ringing false. "Jordan, what brings you all the way out here? Is everything all right?" Before Jordan could respond, Gerald's eyes darted past him, widening as they landed on the car where Sharon sat with the baby. Recognition flashed briefly across his face before being masked by calculated denial. Thelma, standing slightly behind her husband, stared at the infant with an unnerving intensity, her hands trembling at her sides. The sight of her reaction only confirmed Jordan's suspicions that something was terribly wrong. "I think you know why I'm here," Jordan said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "I found my son at Sherry's grave this morning." Gerald's demeanor shifted instantly from false politeness to open hostility. "What nonsense are you talking about? Sherry died before giving birth. You know that, Jordan. We all mourned that loss together." Jordan stood his ground, his resolve strengthening. "Then how do you explain the DNA test that proves he's my child, or the note I found with him, written in Sherry's handwriting? Now tell me, where's my wife?" Thelma let out a small gasp, quickly stifled by Gerald's sharp glance. The older man's face contorted with anger as he spat out his response. "This is preposterous. Are you trying to extort money from us with this ridiculous story? That child could be yours with any woman for all we know." The confrontation took an ugly turn as Gerald's voice lowered, his words dripping with disdain. "You people are always looking for ways to squeeze money from respectable families like ours, aren't you?" The racial undertones of his accusation hung heavy in the air. Jordan felt a surge of anger, but maintained his composure, emphasizing his peaceful intention in traveling from Virginia. "This isn't about money, Gerald. I just want to know the truth about my wife and child." Sharon's protective anger rose at the slur against her son. She exited the car with the boy in her arms and called out, "How dare you speak to my son that way? We're here for answers, not your bigotry." The tension escalated as the baby's sudden cry caused Thelma to instinctively reach forward, her maternal reaction betraying the knowledge she was trying to hide. Her quick retreat behind Gerald after their eyes met spoke volumes. Jordan pressed on, presenting the laundry stamp card he had found. "This was with the baby. It's from a laundry near here. Can you explain that?" Gerald's continued denials contrasted sharply with Thelma's increasing distress. "You'll find nothing here, Jordan. We're still grieving Sherry's death, and your presence with this child is only adding to our burden." The tension peaked as Gerald demanded they leave. "Just visit the laundry if you want information. There's nothing for you here." Realizing he wouldn't get more information, Jordan decided to leave. As he turned to go, Sharon called out one last time, "Why didn't you let Jordan see Sherry in the coffin? He rushed from the airport, trying to make it in time. You couldn't postpone closing the casket for just a moment?" Gerald fumbled for an explanation. We couldn't delay the service any longer. It was a difficult time for everyone." His voice wavered, but then he turned sharply to Jordan, his tone hardening. "And it was your fault for leaving her during her last month of pregnancy. What did you think was going to happen? What kind of husband?" He cut himself off, shaking his head in frustration. "Clearly, Sherry was not safe with you." Sharon pressed further before Jordan could explain himself. "If you're still grieving, why haven't you visited Sherry's grave? Jordan's been there every week, but he's never seen you." Gerald hastily lied. "I've visited a few times, our paths just didn't cross." Suddenly, Thelma burst into tears and fled inside, her composure crumbling under the weight of the moment. Jordan instinctively stepped forward, his hand half raised to stop her, but hesitated. Sharon's eyes widened in alarm, darting between the retreating figure and Jordan's conflicted expression. Before anyone could act, Gerald raised his hand in a commanding wave, and two guards swiftly moved to block the entrance. "Enough," he said coldly, his gaze fixed on Jordan. This isn't your place anymore. We've talked enough." As Jordan and Sharon turned to leave, a low, rhythmic thumping sound echoed from within the house. Both paused, their curiosity piqued. "What's that?" Sharon asked, her brow furrowing. Gerald's expression tightened, but he quickly forced a casual tone. "Oh, just the gardeners," he said with a dismissive wave. "They're planting a new tree in the backyard, probably hammering the stakes into the ground." The explanation came quickly, but it lacked conviction. Jordan exchanged a glance with Sharon, his skepticism growing as the sound continued, steady and deliberate. "Leave now," Gerald demanded, his voice cold, "or I'll be forced to call the police." Jordan, realizing he wouldn't get any more information here, returned to the car with Sharon and the baby. As they drove away, both were silent, processing the hostile encounter and the many questions it had raised. The confrontation had yielded more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. There was far more to Sherry's supposed death than they had been led to believe. As they left the property, Jordan's determination to uncover the truth only grew stronger. As Jordan's car approached the closing automatic gates, he glanced in the rearview mirror. What he saw made his heart stop. Sherry's terrified face was visible for a split second as guards dragged her deeper into the house. Her long golden hair was unmistaken. "Hold on!" Jordan shouted to Sharon, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Without a second thought, he threw the car into reverse, slamming his foot on the accelerator. The engine roared in protest as the car shot backward toward the narrowing gates. Metal shrieked against metal, side mirrors cracking as they were torn from the car. But with a final burst of force, the vehicle broke through, skidding to a stop just outside the mansion's imposing facade. "Jordan, what are you doing?" Sharon screamed, her voice barely audible over the baby's wailing cries. She clutched the child tightly, her panic mirrored in his trembling sobs. Jordan didn't answer immediately, his breath coming fast as he stared at the house, determination burning in his eyes. "I think I saw Sherry. Something's not right," he finally said, his voice low but resolute. "I'm not leaving until I know what's going on. Mum, stay here. Lock the car." Jordan burst through the front door, his heart pounding. The foyer erupted into chaos. 2 security guards immediately seized him, their grip professional and unrelenting. Through the struggle, he watched helplessly as Sherry, crying and fighting, disappeared behind a heavy door somewhere in the mansion's depths. "Sherry!" Jordan shouted, his voice echoing off the marble floors before being silenced by the slamming door. Gerald stood at the heart of the chaos, his presence commanding, as if he thrived on the tension crackling in the air. His voice, calm but edged with menace, sliced through the noise like a blade. "You should have left and never looked back," he said, his tone deceptively casual, though the steel beneath it was unmistakable. His gaze bore into Jordan, unyielding. "You know you can only be with Sherry over my dead body." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of prejudice, dominance, and calculated control. Gerald's stance exuded power, his entire demeanor daring anyone to challenge the authority he had so meticulously cultivated. Turning to Thelma, Gerald barked an order. "Make yourself useful, woman. Get the baby from Sharon, now." Taking advantage of Jordan's distraction as he watched Thelma approach the car, Gerald landed a devastating punch. Jordan crashed to the polished floor, the impact jarring through his body. Gerald towered over him, his voice cold with threat. "If Sharon doesn't surrender that child, my men will beat you to death right here." As the confrontation escalated, Gerald's composure cracked. His confession spilled out in bitter waves, revealing the full extent of his scheme. "I orchestrated everything while you were on that business trip," Gerald snarled. "I brought Sherry home under the guise of special prenatal care. I paid hospital staff to falsify death records. I told her you had died in a plane crash." His voice swelled with twisted pride as he continued. "I did what I had to do to keep my family line pure. That mixed-race child is a contamination, despite its fair appearance." The full horror of his actions became clear, how he had manipulated Sherry into postpartum depression, controlling her every move since giving birth in the house. Gerald's face contorted with disgust as he spoke about the baby, declaring it a contamination of his family line. Jordan lay on the floor, his mind reeling from the revelations and the physical pain. But even as Gerald's words filled him with rage, a glimmer of hope burned in his chest. Sherry was alive. Their child was here. Somehow he had to find a way to save them both. As Jordan struggled to release Gerald's hand on himself, he heard the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. Sharon must have called them from the car. Gerald's face contorted with rage as he realized his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. Gerald sneered, his face flushed with anger as he loomed over Jordan. "You think the police will help you?" he taunted, his voice dripping with contempt. "I own half the force in this town. They'll do exactly what I tell them to do." "Let's see about that," Jordan said, and Gerald landed a last punch before he released his holds on Jordan with a final shove. Jordan groaned as he pushed himself to his feet, his body aching from the scuffle. He wiped the blood from his split lip and nose with the back of his hand, glaring up at Gerald with defiance burning in his eyes. Gerald adjusted his cuffs with calculated composure, as though the confrontation had been nothing more than an inconvenient chore. "You should have stayed gone," he said coldly, his voice low but charged with authority. "Now you're in deeper than you can handle." But even as the words left his mouth, the mansion's circular driveway filled with patrol cars, their lights casting red and blue shadows through the ornate windows. Gerald's attempt to dismiss the officers failed as Sharon emerged from the car with the baby, presenting physical evidence of his crimes. The officers entered the mansion, their faces stern and professional. "Mr. Williams," one of them addressed Gerald, "we've received reports of a disturbance and possible kidnapping. We need to investigate the premises." Gerald's smug confidence began to waver. "This is ridiculous. There's been no kidnapping. This man," he pointed at Jordan, who was slowly getting to his feet, "is trespassing and making wild accusations." Gerald leaned closer to the lead officer, lowering his voice. "Listen," he whispered, slipping a hand into his coat pocket. A crisp stack of bills appeared, barely concealed. "We can settle this quietly. No need to trouble anyone's evening, least of all yours. Just turn around, take your men, and walk away." He glanced meaningfully at the officer's badge, his smile icy. "I'm sure your loyalty has its price." The lead officer's face darkened. He stepped back, crossing his arms deliberately as he spoke. "Sorry, Gerald. Even money has its limits sometimes," the lead officer stated firmly, as Gerald threatened their jobs and families. "Now we have witnesses and evidence of a crime. We need to see all occupants of this house immediately. You should be smarter next time." Jordan, still recovering from the earlier struggle, heard every word clearly. His pulse quickened as he processed the officer's unwavering stance. He had no idea how much more was unfolding inside that house, but he knew this was their moment. It was happening, finally. The walls that Gerald had built around his empire of lies were beginning to crumble. Gerald's face paled as he realized his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. In a final act of defiance, Gerald lunged for Sharon and the baby, but the officers quickly restrained him. The scene in the foyer became a tableau of justice. Gerald in handcuffs, his security guards surrendering their weapons, while Thelma trembled with a mixture of relief and fear at her own courage. As the police secured the scene, Thelma's transformation came suddenly and powerfully. Standing in the grand foyer, her usual timid demeanor fell away as she turned on her husband. Her voice, shaking but determined, revealed everything. "I can't do this anymore," Thelma cried out, her eyes wild with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I told Sherry the truth about Jordan being alive. That's why she went to the cemetery this morning. She was trying to find a way to get the baby to Jordan." The revelation explained Sherry's presence at the cemetery and her strategic placement of the baby where she hoped Jordan would find him. Jordan's heart swelled with love and admiration for Sherry's bravery and quick thinking. As Thelma continued her confession, more details emerged about the extent of Gerald's control. The private medical staff hired to deliver the baby in secret, the surveillance systems installed to monitor Sherry's every move, the elaborate web of lies spun to maintain his facade of respectability. "He manipulated Sherry's postpartum depression," Thelma sobbed. "He convinced her that Jordan had died in a plane crash. He kept her isolated, controlled her every move. I was too afraid to stop him." Each revelation added to the charges being listed by the officers, painting a picture of a man whose prejudice and desire for control had driven him to unthinkable acts. As Gerald was being led away in handcuffs, he made one last attempt to assert his authority. "You'll regret this," he snarled at Jordan. "I'll use every penny I have to bury you in legal battles. You'll never see that child again." But his threats fell on deaf ears. The officers had heard enough, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. As the police processed the scene and took statements, a commotion from upstairs drew everyone's attention. Sherry, having broken free from her unlocked room with the help of an officer, ran down the grand staircase. "Jordan!" she cried out, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Their embrace in the mansion's foyer carried the weight of their month-long separation. Tears streamed down both their faces as they held each other, the reality of their reunion finally sinking in. Through her tears, Sherry explained her fear at the cemetery. "I saw you, but I was so scared," she sobbed. "I didn't know if it was really you or... So I ran. But then I came back with the baby, once I felt sure you'd be there to find him." The baby's cries cut through the emotional moment. Sherry rushed to Sharon, her hands trembling as she took her son for the first time since being forced to abandon him. Her relief at finding him safe dissolved into grateful tears as Sharon explained how she had helped care for him during their journey. In the mansion's living room, now bustling with police officers and paramedics, Sherry revealed the details of her captivity. She described the trauma of being told Jordan had died, the isolation of giving birth under her father's strict control, and the constant threats and manipulation. "They had doctors and nurses here, paid off to keep everything secret," Sherry explained, her voice shaking. "I thought I was going crazy. They kept telling me you were dead, that I was delusional from grief and postpartum depression." She turned to her mother, a mixture of gratitude and residual anger in her eyes. "When Mum finally told me the truth about Jordan being alive, I knew I had to do something. I didn't know how to escape with the baby, so I took a chance at the cemetery." Jordan held Sherry close, his heart aching for the ordeal she had endured. "You were so brave," he whispered, "so incredibly brave." As the reunited family sat together, their son cradled between them, the full weight of their ordeal began to settle. They had survived. They were together, but the road to healing would be long and challenging. As the police finished processing the scene and Gerald was led away, Thelma approached the reunited family. Her face was etched with remorse and fear. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she began, her voice trembling. "But please don't leave tonight. Stay here. It's getting late soon, and you've all been through so much." Jordan and Sherry exchanged glances, uncertainty clear in their eyes, but it was Sharon who spoke up. "That might be for the best," she said gently. "We're all exhausted, and the baby needs rest too. We can figure out our next steps in the morning." Thelma nodded gratefully, then turned to Sherry. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart, for everything. I should have stood up to your father years ago." As Thelma busied herself preparing rooms for them, Sharon joined her and they worked together to gather supplies for the baby. Their shared concern for the younger family created a tentative bridge between them. In the nursery that had become Sherry's prison, Jordan and Sherry finally had a moment alone with their son. Sherry cradled the baby close, her eyes never leaving his face. "I named him Jerry," she said softly. "It's a combination of our names, Jordan and Sherry." Jordan's eyes filled with tears as he gently stroked his son's cheek. "It's perfect," he whispered. "He's perfect." As Sherry placed baby Jerry in the crib, the couple stood in silence, watching their son sleep. Jordan wrapped his arm around Sherry's waist, pulling her close. "I thought I'd lost you both," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been visiting your grave every week, talking to you, telling you about my day." Sherry turned in his arms, burying her face in his chest. "I'm so sorry, Jordan. I wanted to tell you, to find a way to reach you, but I was so scared, and they had me convinced you were gone." As they held each other, the enormity of what they had endured and overcome washed over them. Their reunion, as joyous as it was, marked only the beginning of their journey to heal and rebuild their life together. The next morning dawned bright and clear. a stark contrast to the darkness that had shrouded the Williams mansion for so long. The house bustled with activity as preparations were made for Jordan, Sherry, and baby Jerry's return to Virginia. Thelma, eager to make amends, helped pack Jerry's belongings. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded tiny onesies and blankets, each item a reminder of the time she had lost with her grandson. Sharon, ever practical, made arrangements for a proper car seat and additional supplies for the journey home. As she moved through the house, the morning light streaming through the windows seemed to symbolize the fresh start that lay ahead for all of them. A police detective arrived to gather final statements, confirming that Gerald faced multiple charges: kidnapping, false imprisonment, filing false reports, and attempted child abandonment. The detective assured them that the corrupted hospital staff and officials would also face consequences. "We'll need you to testify," the detective explained gently, "but not for a while. Take some time to heal and be with your family." As they prepared to leave, Thelma approached Sherry, her eyes brimming with tears. "I know I have no right to ask this," she began hesitantly, "but may I visit you sometime? Get to know my grandson?" Sherry hesitated, then nodded slowly. "We'll need time," she said softly, "but yes, I think that would be good, for all of us." The family dynamic had shifted profoundly as they drove away from the mansion. Sharon and Thelma exchanged contact information, planning future visits. In the back seat, Sherry held baby Jerry securely in his new car seat, while Jordan drove them toward Virginia, toward their true home and the life they had almost lost. As they passed the cemetery where everything had begun just 24 hours earlier, Sherry reached for Jordan's hand. Their eyes met in the rearview mirror, both understanding how close they had come to losing each other forever, and how love, courage, and a mother's intuition had brought their family back together against seemingly impossible odds. "We're going home," Jordan said softly, squeezing Sherry's hand. Sherry nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "we're all going home." As they drove on, leaving behind the pain and darkness of the past month, the road ahead stretched out before them, a path to healing, to rebuilding, and to the future they had always dreamed of sharing together. The journey wouldn't be easy, but with their love for each other and their son, they knew they could face whatever challenges lay ahead.